being scolded, and didn't feel entirely convinced. So I reaffirmed it to him. You must become a teacher. He didn't show any signs of anything else, but I could tell he trusted me. During this process, the manager of the Gold Center grew very fond of me and respected me, something I'd never had before in my professional life. This was opening doors wide for me, and I was starting to have money in my pocket. The manager was enthusiastic, and wanted us to break into the elementary schools, starting with the one across the street. She also organized my students from the transformative astrology school and sometimes invited me to lunch. So we had a good time, especially because she had a hard time understanding these horoscope things, despite belonging to the GFU and already having a degree. Sometimes she tried to be my student, but I was surprised that she couldn't grasp everything I was explaining. But she loved me quite a bit. I remember very well that one day I trusted her so much that I confessed to her that I did not have the appropriate clothing to give public lectures, mainly because I had in mind Americo Living Trail 133. What the elder brother had warned me in the vision I had with him, in which he gave me the order, put on a suit. When I told her this, my manager friend looked thoughtful, and after a while said, "Don't worry, Professor, let me try." 2 weeks later, he told me to go see one of his relatives, because they were going to deliver some suits to me. He warned me that they were dealing with millionaires. They lived next to Plaza San Angel, precisely in the place where, for a time, I used to go every 2 weeks, while studying a course at the Genhisa restaurant, which was also located next to Plaza San Angel. At that restaurant, a well-known astrologer was the director of a branch of the American Astrological Association. Since I wanted to achieve official recognition for my work as an astrologer, and in Mexico there wasn't such a professional program as there was, for example, at a university college in England, as I said, I attended that place for a while, until I finally completed the first level of that important, more professional study related to astrology. Anyway, the fact is, I got there and actually ran into a very serious and difficult lady to deal with. In reality, there was no astrology professor or anything like that here, just a poor ragman who came to pick up some clothing that these rich people were about to throw away. This reminded me that not everyone could see in me what some could. As soon as I could, I went to the manager to thank her. She, always with a distinguished demeanor, listened to me, and burst into joy, finally laughing out loud that she had clothes on. She added, "Now things are going to go well for you, brother, because putting on those millionaire's clothes will bring you luck." Dr. Shayamichan lived between his financial needs and his marvelous ability to raise centers by virtue of his good management of money. But, on the other hand, he had strong emotional conflicts between being well with his own family, involved in the key positions of his centers, and at the same time, responding altruistically to the GFU. To this had to be added all of us who were working in this company, especially those of us who truly loved a mission for the new age, to the point that what this majority simply wanted was to take all the personal benefit they could from a man who had been able to raise himself financially, when La GFU beforehand despised this vision. It was during these kinds of debates within his own naturist centers that, fortunately for me, Dr. Shayamichan couldn't find the director for his naturism school and shows me Americo Living Trail 134. There was, of course, the person serving as director. He was a kind-hearted person, and I didn't want to overthrow him. For this reason, I didn't pay much attention to Dr. Shayamichan's request that I become director of his naturism school. I attended that school as a subject teacher, and there was the person who would become my retreat partner. But I didn't suspect it yet because she acted quietly, despite being so different from the rest of the attendees. In front of the students of the naturism school, Dr. Shea openly insisted that he accept to be the director of the naturism school, and said to the one who was still director, "Don't worry, because without lowering your salary, I want you to come with me, so you can help me with the hotel in Tepoztlan." So I was appointed director of the naturism school with a fixed monthly salary, and at the same time, I continued with my transformative astrology school group. After the first day of being officially the director of the naturism school, Shea appeared to ask them how they were with their new director and asked them. I'm sure I'm not mistaken. Everyone began to applaud at the wisdom of his decision. A light I'd never experienced before began to fill me everywhere. The period of my life at the Shea Centers was taking on its own unique character. Everything began to take on color. One of these days, as I was leaving Tabasco High School, where I worked as the director and also as a teacher of astrodiagnosis at the naturist school, I saw one of my students making a call on the phone on the corner. She didn't look very attractive, because she wasn't wearing makeup and her clothing consisted of a kind of skirt that reached below her knees, or perhaps baggy pants. I was chatting with other students, while she was on the phone to her mother, as she later confessed to me. I was interested in talking to her, because I was at the stage, where I felt respected by students in something I did enjoy teaching, my astrology class. For that reason, I wanted everyone to be happy, as I was myself. When my student finished her call, I noticed she was a little upset, trying not to look at me, and she walked off toward Insurgents. I ended my conversation with the people I was talking to, as always after class, and walked behind the restless student. She got a little nervous, and looked at me out of the corner of her eye. When I got close, I said hello, and that was the beginning of my relationship with an unforgettable woman. I began to feel inspired like never before, in a search for truth and happiness above all else. Such was the force with which this woman began to attract me, that I was willing to do everything within the right limits. But not to blindly possess her, but because her energy was so similar to mine, and I needed to be with her. Certainly, I was experiencing passionate love, but by no means a blind passion. Americo Living Trail 135. The roses began to bloom uncontrollably, and my heart leaped with joy every time I went to my naturism class, and found a real woman there. At first, I wanted to treat her like the others, but little by little, I was awakening to a wonderful and unknown world. Second, withdrawal. Freeing myself from the lunar network. I was beginning to find myself, but there were energies I still couldn't control. These were elemental knowledges I couldn't grasp, because I lacked perspective. Like most people, I was susceptible to criticism from the people around me, and to the uncontrolled sexual passions that seemed to be perpetually waiting for us in the shadows of the night. In contrast to the happiness I was able to feel for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to handle things well, in the privileged position in which fate had placed me with this man, named Shayamichin, who, in his own way, loved me. I was wounded by my failed relationship, and tired of perpetual poverty, burdened by the responsibility of my paternal family from an early age. The only way to survive all this was to break free from this crushing social machine, which carried me on its gigantic blades, like those oversized arms against which Don Quixote struggled. I had to challenge my mechanical destiny, that was leading me toward the fatal failure of my entire life. I didn't know, even if he had tried to explain it to me, that there was a lunar network, much less a Christ consciousness network, also called solar, and that the majority of humanity belongs to one of them and the rest, very few, to the other. It would take several years after my retreat to understand that the lunar network is composed of what the Tibetan master, in his masterpiece, Treatise on Cosmic Fire, calls the lunar pitras. This refers to people lacking willpower, and who live primarily from the Americo Living Trail 136. Emotional, the collective, and the imitation of everything they perceive and reason. So, a great intellectual can exist, and still be emotional. Humanity behaves in a network, and this is how it reacts. This lunar network responds to biological genetics and customs, as well as a natural tendency toward polygamy. However, even then I could be certain of one thing, that consciousness is an individual phenomenon, not a collective one. This realized concept was a fundamental pillar of the teaching at my school of transformative astrology. These are all just words, but when you search with your heart in your hand, the truth begins to unfold, and we experience all that it entails. As director of the naturism school, I was still trapped in the lunar network. People's opinions, their conditioning, their laws, their morals, their sentimentality, and their way of loving largely controlled my life. Even though the individual in me already felt ready to begin conscious love, so still, my way of loving was mostly sentimental, and, consequently, quite emotional, unstable, and immature. It was with this nature that I began to identify with my group at the naturist school, and this very thing prevented me from realizing that these students didn't need to change fundamentally, because they were fine on their own. I wanted to grasp them as individual beings, but they weren't ready yet, and I couldn't detect it in time. In reality, there were many opposing views within the Shayamitchan naturopathic centers, and the doctor loved his family, the brotherhood, and the people, and in this position, he was trying to be fair. Furthermore, many people were looking for ways to take advantage of his goodwill. For my part, I was blinded by my desire for the centers to be subject to a royal initiation. I still had that strange vice that is acquired in Lodgy post-war America by defending Estradismo, blindly loving Maestro Estrada. Far from eliminating it, I had reinforced it. This vice can basically be defined as taking sides with someone or something. Indeed, in our desire to help humanity, we often take sides with group, ceasing to be impartial, and with this, we lose the universal perspective of life, humanity as a unit. So, emotionally, I began defending the students against the injustices being carried out at the Naturist Center, where I was the school director. One day, without consulting Dr. Shea, who was always very busy, I took a misguided initiative, and decided that the backyard should be covered with a tarp, so the students could comfortably conduct their yoga class. This, of course, did not please Dr. Shayamitchan, but as was his custom, he said nothing, directly. Furthermore, the end of the school year was approaching, and the students had no real preparation. Which wasn't right. But at the same time, I was unable to assess the doctor's Americo Living Trail 137 needs, for whom the important thing was that this school year be completed no matter what, because he urgently needed new students to enroll and contribute their money. It was a difficult situation, and I was not practical, but in the name of God I decided that those who did not truly succeed in becoming naturopathic healers, as they were promised at the beginning of the course, could not be recognized. Shea also acted on his own. He exhausted his patience, and one day, without telling me, because it was his way of avoiding confrontation problems, according to him, he called the students, and together with the assistant manager of the Oro Institute he gave them their diplomas, only because they did not owe any monthly fees. Dr. Shayamitchan wasn't perfect, but that's not the point. The serious thing is that I had taken sides thinking I was doing the right thing, unable to put myself in Dr. Shayamitchan's perspective. To tell the truth, he had to pay for the radio services at a stratospheric monthly amount of $250,000 pesos, since it consisted of many hours a week, and all of us enjoyed that privilege for free, although we were definitely his unconditional fans. I was wrong about how things work in life and what it means to love humanity. Maybe Dr. Shea and the hierarchs of La GFU were also imperfect, but that didn't excuse me. Shortly after this incident, Shayamitchan again, without informing me, appointed another director as the director of the naturism school. Both directors met on the radio, and Dr. Shea was also there. So, I acted naturally, making it clear that I accepted the dismissal, and that I appreciated the new director's help in any way possible. This simple incident in my life was to become the trigger that ultimately led me to my retirement. Over time, I've realized that the retreat is basically about mastering the moon and truly vibrating with the Christ consciousness grid, which requires a perspective on life. We are so closely tied to people and their customs, that we are unable to truly acquire our own individuality. If all humanity already had perspective on one another, retreat would not be necessary, because we could all innately remain retreated without actually retreating. When I started my retirement, it wasn't because I thought something like, I'm going to retire on such a day and such a date, and I'll do it for 40 months. This is nonsense, and I'm surprised that the GFU has become so popular that this is how it should be, because no one who speaks seriously acts in this regulated way, but rather according to their own individual path, and, therefore, also taking into account our particular needs. Americo Living Trail 138. For my part, and based on my experience, I'm certain that this is not how the decisions of a true initiate, or initiatee, on a living path work, that is, not on a symbolic path, but on a path taken step by step in one's own flesh. What has been transcendent in my life has happened naturally. Perhaps there is another way, but the most common is the natural one, even for the supernatural. That's what Guru Marcelli said, follow the natural path. And I took it very seriously. This is why, at the beginning of my retreat, I didn't realize I was withdrawn like the true initiates and priestesses of the world, dedicated to the salvation of humanity. Only at the end did I realize what I was as an energy. We don't choose ourselves, it's our own state of consciousness that chooses us. It's a higher power that chooses us. All we do is sense it and act accordingly. I began to undergo truly severe tests within my individual path. In the case of my situation at the Shea Mission Centers, the authority of my person had been greater than the ability to understand what happens in the human soul. Humanity inevitably appears between them, to be redeemed. This is something I didn't learn at the GFU, but rather on my path as an initiate. Great loves are eternally linked to the destiny of humanity, and it is for this reason that differences with the world begin to emerge, and with this, our own defects or virtues become greater. Couple love cannot be dual, since, as I said, it always includes humanity. Furthermore, our higher dimensions are being activated, which naturally involves beings of light, as invisible participants in our increasingly conscious process. This is why I recognize that sexuality is always trinity. This is so true that when one of the two members of the couple strays in their love for humanity, at that instant the couple has marked their fatal separation and the end of their wonderful bond. Each and every human being, to one another, is a mirror in which we can see ourselves as we truly are. I didn't fully understand this yet, but I sensed that it referred to La Presentia, the Holy Spirit, spoken of in all religions. There were morals and all the rules that govern society, setting the standards for what we should do. But, on the other hand, my individuality emerged. This is why I began to perceive the teachings of Jesus Christ in a very different way than with simple religious sentimentality. So, I discovered that this instinctive force that drives us to defend those who are our own flesh and blood doesn't necessarily lead to irremediable fatalism, but, in fact, only gives rise to an attitude based on fear of life and an inability to be ourselves. Then, I was able to clearly perceive that teaching of Jesus Christ, which says, Americo Living Trail 139, whoever wants to be my disciple must leave father, mother, children, and even his own life to follow me. I began to sense that I needed to be happy first, in order to become a good father. I had studied myself extensively through my natal chart, and had experienced the threatening failure of my relationship, all in pursuit of a semblance of initiation within the GFU. I was reaching difficult conclusions in my life, where society and morality would not agree with me. Because from the point of view of individuality, legal codes are convenient for maintaining social order, but not necessarily for making the individual happy. In general, legal laws are good and necessary, but particularly when someone, for example, encounters the Christ Virgin, Christ Goddess, in their own state of consciousness, then the man and/or woman cannot function in the same way. This does not mean that they are useless, because what people in general do cannot be completely wrong, obeying their needs according to their survival instinct, and, furthermore, they cannot be forced to behave as individuals when they belong to a life stream naturally based on the force of blood. However, as individuals, we can all realize that each of our children, like each of our parents, is an individual, and the key to a happy society is for everyone to know themselves and achieve true happiness. Since this isn't possible when we aren't prepared for it, only as individuals can we realize that legal laws, in general, often commit injustice. For example, in reality, children are often held hostage by their parents, who use them in war between couples. They are also often used to force a woman to ruin a man's life simply because he had a child with her, and then the guilty party must support her for life. From the perspective of the individual, this is totally unfair, but from the perspective of social well-being, and of a woman who, despite being weaker, suffers abuse, this is correct. Thus, we can begin to realize that when we become individuals, there are things that are right and wrong, and society, with all its legal, social, and religious laws, cannot help us. What is right for them is already wrong for us. With a half-prepared humanity, there are people who believe themselves smarter than others, in a merely external sense, so that they can allow themselves to abuse the weakest, taking advantage of the laws. I had to realize this, immersed in my delicate position as a father of 4 beautiful children, still quite young. The oldest was about 4 years old. But in the midst of all this social and human responsibility, I happened to find the woman of my dreams. So what would win out in my life? My love for her, or a blind obligation to my children. I was reaching the point where I had to know how to define, as an individual, how to abide by the teachings of Jesus Christ on my path, and naturally, I had to do so from a mature perspective, and in no way superficial. Americo Living Trail 140. Undoubtedly, a relationship, especially if there are children involved, should be forever, but humanity is not perfect, and therefore neither are its laws, so, let he who is without error cast the first stone. No one can be a good parent without experiencing holistic fulfillment. Otherwise, we would be, as is the case with many, merely a semblance of a good father or good mother. Nor was it a matter of voting out the children out of weakness or vices. But I firmly understood that marriages based on children are generally due to a flawed idea or decision that makes neither the parents nor the children happy. This had been my experience with my own parents, who stayed together for the sake of their children, yet they weren't truly happy. Furthermore, if we don't know ourselves, it's not worth leaving one family to start another, because it will only continue the chain of unhappiness. But in addition to all this maturation of my ideas, I was being called by higher forces, and a profound love for humanity was being born within me, beyond anything that could bind me in this world. When society gives the proper place to the development of each individual, it begins to uncomplicate its laws, and then the family is sustained by the individuality of each of its members, so that if, for example, two people stop loving each other, they are not obligated to live together, because they had a child. Nor is one obligated to support another for life, just because they once loved them. And since a child who is born has every right to be happy, he or she will go to the father or mother who gives them their love, and is in a position to provide them with minimal financial security. If one of them has the financial means, and the other is willing to keep the child, that's the right thing to do. But if one has the financial means, and the child is better off staying with the other, then that's the right thing to do. These kinds of attitudes were bearing fruit in me, but they were still unclear. I was struggling with what I should do. So the strength of this woman, who was my student at the naturism school, began to define me as an individual, the chosen one. Toward the end of my relationship with the mother of my children, she began to frequent, like a schoolgirl, one of our friends who practiced reflexology. This GFU brother was a good healer of diseases declared incurable. And also around this time, we ran into an incorrigible Aquarian hippie who was advertising himself as a land seller on the outskirts of the city, in a place called La Marquesa. He promised to fulfill his dream of forming a New Age community in the middle of the forest. It would be a center of wisdom, or rather, of mystical fantasies, as I learned. Americo Living Trail 141. So, under the pretext that she needed to see one of these plots of land they were selling in the La Marquesa area, she insisted on going with the salesman to show them to her. I didn't trust her, but I didn't know what good I was in all this, given the way things were, all my hopes of a relationship already dead. Since I sensed suspicion, she decided to take the older child with her. When I returned, I could imagine what had happened, given her status as she was, and in that remote place. Therefore, I wasn't interested in discussing it. Meanwhile, the 2 or 3 times a week I had to go to the naturist school to teach my classes and check on the students. My favorite student and I would arrange to wait for each other at the exit and chat. They were splendid afternoons, that filled with joy and light. We ate together and sometimes chatted, while I took her a little closer to her house. She was married, and her husband had a job that only required him to stay in Mexico City for 6 months, and for 6 months he had to go to a provincial location assigned to him by the company. He worked in communications, and she had a fair suspicion that during those 6 months he was spending time with several women. I found it very interesting how this woman lived something very similar to how, according to Greek mythology, the wife of Pluto, the god of the underworld, was said to have lived. The myth tells of a very beautiful woman who one day was walking through a forest, the earth opened wide, and out of the abyss came the god of hell called Pluto. He kidnapped her, and made her his wife. But when he realized that, Before going down to hell he had eaten a pomegranate seed. Then he concluded that he could not live forever in the abyss, but that he had to spend 6 months on the surface of the earth with his people and the other 6 in the abyss of the earth, with his wife and queen of the underworld. In my talks I had already interpreted this Greek myth, and related it to the fact that every grain and fruit germinates underground for about 6 months, and then blooms when the corresponding season arrives. But now I saw it clearly incarnated with my naturist girlfriend, who for 6 long months spent her time with her family and the other 6 living in her own house with her husband. It was the reason of feeling lonely that made her decide to enter the naturism school. She also began to tell me that she had a very special teacher. When she trusted me more, she told me that her teacher had reached out La Iluminación, and had them meditate in a special way, as well as teaching them acupuncture. He was a very demanding and strange teacher, because since he was young, he had had many women. Then he became paralyzed, and, through acupuncture and his own will, he managed to heal himself. He began practicing yoga and other esoteric disciplines. He had Americo Living Trail 142 contact with UFOs, and it was then that, during the yoga class, he finally reached the point La Iluminación point. He said this was a unique experience, and very difficult for anyone to achieve. The funny thing is, as my girlfriend told me, the yoga teacher was his lover. My friend told me that enlightenment, which consisted of opening the crown center, had been a painful and unexpected process for her teacher, as he knew nothing about it until his head started to hurt terribly, because this unique process opens the 7th chakra, located at the crown of the head, and then it happened. It was because of this experience that his teacher tried to train his students to avoid this lack of preparation, and at the same time, guide them to reach that state. All of them, including her, were doing their internships at a place where he had built a huge metal pyramid as a hotel, with room for 500 rooms inside. Perhaps he meant 50, which would already be quite a lot. He explained to them that, with this pyramid, he was helping Mexico and the planet maintain a certain balance. He was a very intelligent man who held 4 professional degrees, but despite being an enlightened one, he didn't give up his vice of having more than one wife. It's only natural, given that, as my confidant told me, he had a great many women in his days as a sailor. I asked her how many women he had in total, and she confessed, more than 400 in all. That's why it was a great achievement that, as an enlightened one, he was faithful to 2 or 3 regular companions, some of whom already had children. Although from time to time, it might occur to him to choose one of his students to make his partner. I realized that my naturism student didn't agree with the matter, and that's why she stayed away from her teacher in this regard. The teacher's argument was that through sexual contact one can advance in evolution. My girlfriend couldn't explain why, being an enlightened one and such an outstanding being, to the point of having telepathic and clairvoyant contacts with UFOs, her life as a couple was not stable. She loved and respected him very much. She had disciplined herself to attend the weekly, or bi-weekly meditations she had with him where she lived. And when that happened, she had to wait for him for more than 2 hours. Because as soon as the students arrived, one of his current lovers would also be there, and he would call her privately. And everyone knew it was to have sex with her. Afterward, the 2 of them would happily go downstairs to continue the instruction. My companion told me that her lovers weren't vulgar people but very distinguished, both personally and socially. He had contact with an extraterrestrial commando called UL. They spoke to him telepathically, and allowed him access, I believe, in the astral plane, to a UFO hidden beneath his master's residence. Americo Living Trail 143. Between comments and answering several of my questions, he told me that yes, someone had indeed achieved enlightenment by opening the 7th chakra. In this guru's house, going down to the bottom, there was a place with a spiral-shaped dome. The most advanced candidates would pass through there. The master would place acupuncture needles in special places on their heads, and then leave them meditating there. This was because this acupuncturist was researching ways to stimulate the pineal gland through rays that science could manipulate. He could apply it to people and directly stimulate their brains, thus leading them more easily toward enlightenment. When I asked her if she had had sexual relations with him, she told me that she had desired him, but nothing really happened. Mainly because she was beings of light cared for her. And once, during a meditation, she had perceived the name Duajkal, and asked the master what it could mean. He told her that her soulmate was Duajkal. And because of this, her instructor had respect for her, and even a certain fear. Furthermore, one day we visited Ferrer's bookstore at the GFU National Headquarters, located on Insurgents Avenue near Colima Street. I saw a photo of the Tibetan Duajkal they were selling there, and showed it to her, telling her that this was a great master, an instructor of the avatars of the age of Aquarius. My companion was very moved because, she told me, he was her soulmate. Later, when I was still working for Shea Mitchin, she once accompanied me to the center called Nicholas Romero. I had been invited to this place by some friendly women who were the owners. And although they were fervent followers of Shea Mitchin, they still admired me. That was the reason for their invitation, in the hope that I could teach astrology classes. When I arrived, they didn't like my new companion very much, because they asked me about my children, and, somehow, they already knew the previous one. But amidst the emotional conflict these good people were experiencing, and the discomfort they caused my current girlfriend, due to the false idea that I had a solid Aquarian marriage with Nazarene children, whose hair is left until they are 7 years old, despite everything, the conversation between us developed, and my companion, very anxiously, asked me if they knew so-and-so, referring to his old teacher, a former sailor. And I did. Of course, one of them said. He's a nice, lively person. He showed up one day to introduce himself, and find out what we were doing. He told us he lived in the village, Magu, explaining a little about what he did. Later, after leaving my retreat, I met an instructor who had contact with extraterrestrials. And she told me about this acupuncturist master, because coincidentally, she had also met him. But I didn't know anything about him being enlightened or anything like that. Something else that happened in relation to this master, is that he used an emblem he made himself out of copper, representing the seal of Ul. He later helped my girlfriend make a smaller one. By the way, by the time I left my retreat, and returned to my mother and children, when I searched through my things, I found a large medallion with the Ul emblem and a thick copper chain. Something that only the master acupuncturist used, and perhaps, I think, Americo Living Trail 144, his most advanced students. I think my partner, eager to give me something to protect me, secretly put it in my things, when I returned home to my parents and children. But during that time, I was somewhat upset, and didn't resonate with all the teachings of this master or his extraterrestrial command. And since I didn't want to be bothered by them, I carefully wrapped it in a piece of paper, and threw it away. She also told me that in another area of this instructor's residence, there was a place called the tomb. A person was prepared to remain there for about 10 days, almost without food and only drinking water. While my companion was telling me about this, which only the instructor himself, or an advanced student could attempt, she began to laugh, because she remembered a time when the master's official companion and his current lover had joined her at the same meditation appointment. And since she didn't know how to resolve the matter, the master said she should stay in the tomb. And that's how she resolved the issue. She then showed me an instruction book her teacher used, which dealt with extraterrestrial science. It spoke of particles smaller than atoms, like neutrinos, which were related to the Trinity. Official quantum science either knows very little about this, or isn't interested in it. At the time, I couldn't dedicate myself to studying the subject. But after my retreat, that information came back to me. And I recorded it in one of my written works dealing with transformative astrology lessons. This is how the topic of her former sailor teacher and others began to develop as a regular part of our conversation between my new companion and me. These topics, naturally, are inaccessible to most people due to their esoteric nature. It was then that I discovered she could see auras, and wanted me to see them. To this end, she prepared some brightly colored cards, light green and yellow, and strongly recommended that I contemplate them for about an hour straight. Day after day, she did this, so that my retina would adapt, and I would eventually see what she saw around people. When I taught naturism classes, my girlfriend used to leave a little early, and go to Alvaro Obregón Avenue and sit on a bench to wait for me. From where I taught, I could see her. One of the classroom windows overlooked a low house, and beyond, you could see the central median strip of Alvaro Obregón Avenue. An incredible compatibility flowed between us. It was as if my brief courtship with the acupuncturist from La GFU now continued in a more real way. I'd never had the opportunity to experience a courtship in my life, and at that time, whenever we went to a vegetarian restaurant, a cafe, or just walked together, I felt intensely happy, and she felt the same. Little by little, she learned about my situation, and that I had children, but even so, there was a sixth sense that kept her going. Something inside her, which she didn't know what it was at first, was pushing her to keep going, despite everything. But then I began to realize that they were invisible beings belonging to the light, who were advising her not to leave me alone. I didn't fully understand what was happening to her in this regard, because I actually fell in love without knowing she was a psychic. But she also possessed such humility, to the point that she never boasted about this fact to me, except when she considered it essential for Americo Living Trail 145 me to know. La GFU, the Great Universal Fraternity, U.S., would never have been able to retain such women within its ranks, for they are as free as the birds that soar through the skies. That is to say, they are truly the embodiment of a great universal fraternity as a state of consciousness. After about 3 months of treatment, I decided to invite her to a hotel, as I considered my relationship with my partner to be over. We discussed it, taking our situation into account, and agreed that we would continue our previous relationships for the time being, knowing that it was natural for our partners to want to have sex with us. And it was under these conditions that we finally decided to get together. Our first intimate union proved that our compatibility wasn't a myth, but a wonderful reality. From then on, we routinely had sex once a week, and the rest was just having a good time, as if the courtship would continue forever. Shortly after, her husband appeared, and she had relations with him, but when we met, she told me this couldn't last long, because she truly loved me, and being touched by another man had been unbearable. It felt the same to me. She was in a dilemma, and without consulting me, she offered him the option to go to the provinces and try to start a new life. Being a very disciplined person, for whom marital relations were not the most important thing, but rather maintaining social status, he replied that this was impossible, because his job prevented him from doing so. He later told me that he had a vision in which a demon was in his house. His skin had been ripped off, so that his reddened, bleeding skin could be seen. He was furious and suffering greatly, because his red-hot skin was causing him great pain. Trying to help him interpret this, we wanted to conclude that it was a dilemma in his life. For my part, I was lucky, because after having to fulfill my marital duties twice with the mother of my children, she recently suffered an identity crisis, during which she told me, through tears and remorse, that the previous evening she had seduced the reflexology doctor. He didn't really want to, but she insisted. She sincerely sought refuge in me, for she realized that I loved her, at least as a loyal friend. And I had truly demonstrated this consistently, ever since I met her. However, I didn't have much I could do for her. I've written about the mother of my children in a very raw and direct way, but not with the intention of making her a monster. But the truth is, I've always been aware that she was a valuable person to me. It's just that she unleashed her sexuality in an unusual way, because she was manipulated by invisible, destructive, and evil forces eager to thwart my path, which evidently turned out to be more extraordinary than that of the common mystics and yogis of the world in general. This is why I know that this woman, the mother of my children, is valuable from the perspective of wisdom and service to humanity. Proof of this is that she was brave in each of her psychoprophylactic births, conscious natural birth, relying on yoga postures, breathing, and an ovo-lacto-vegetarian diet. So, in a way, I've always loved and admired her. But we both had to follow our paths, and we did so by ending Americo Living Trail 146, our relationship, like fraternal brothers. And I think she always felt the same way. In one letter, she expressed her admiration for my personality and her longing to find a man like me, but one she was truly in love with. Anyway, back to my story. This reflexologist friend, whenever I met him from then on, couldn't look me in the eyes. I never complained to him about anything. There was nothing to complain about. I already knew my student from the naturism school, and we had had intimate relations, although the children's mother didn't know, and shouldn't have known yet. So I took advantage of this incident, involving her affair with the reflexology student, to express to her earnestly that I no longer wanted to have sex with her, and that was it. I would never have sexual relations with the mother of my children again. The mother of my children also found herself needing to make decisions about her life, and told me how she felt. She wanted a stable relationship, acknowledging that she didn't love me. That week I had a dream. My naturist girlfriend stood near me, and offered me her arm to help me up, and walk with her. I accepted it, and was able to move forward. Shortly after, the mother of my children received some money she had requested from her parents. It wasn't much, nor was it little, but with that money, she developed the desire to buy a small car. I was going to arrange this with one of my law school transformative astrology students, who would sell me his car, which was a bit old, but perfect for the use I would give it and very cheap. Since I finally had some money, I began buying some things necessary for my children's house and their mothers. And so, although humbly, we could finally call this a home. I even bought her a sewing machine, as she had the idea of making clothes. I knew it would most likely never come to fruition, as she couldn't sit still for long. When I felt more financially secure, while still being poor, I discussed the possibility of separating. She was still open to being friends. I asked her where she'd like to live, if only my maternal family bothered her in this house. After taking a moment to think about it, she replied, "I would like to live in Teotihuacan, to be close to the pyramids." I promised her I would take care of everything. I mentioned this to my girlfriend, who immediately offered to accompany me, and after a few days, we went to Teotihuacan, until we found a suitable place. In reality, it was a small paradise, since it was an unoccupied house, that was rented at a good price. But I was particularly worried, or rather, frightened, by the fact that this house was right on the street that leads to the Pyramid La Luna. Estimates speaking of which, there was less than half a kilometer between this house and the Pyramid Point La Luna. Americo Living Trail 147. I was realizing that, if I rented this house, the mother of my children would be aligning herself with the lunar force. However, given the circumstances, I decided to go ahead. Besides, the offer couldn't be ignored. My mother wasn't happy with my decision, because she feared the children would be left alone with that woman. I calmed her down, and said very seriously, "I know this woman has made many mistakes, but we all have one last chance. Let her go." He reluctantly agreed. When we were still living in Netzahualcoyotl, and the days went by, the mother of my children realized that I was determined to continue my life, and then she began to get uncomfortable. I had to move things along, and one day, during an argument, I warned her, "Before you leave this house for Teotihuacan, I will no longer be here." Since I had had many weaknesses, apparently, in the relationship with her, she didn't believe me. The situation at the Oro Center was getting difficult because my friend, the manager of this place, had been fired for the simple reason that what was needed was money, and she, above all, offered them her loyalty. But, naturally, that wasn't enough, when it came to stopping the whirlwind of human folly. And without a sister, so important in my life, I felt truly unprotected. But I had faith in my students, who were already following me in some way as aspiring disciples. The one who sold me the car was the most outstanding, and showed great faith in me. And it was he who, weighing the situation, came up with the crazy idea of opening our own center, so we could dedicate ourselves to astrology together. I immediately agreed, and we began looking for a suitable location. He owned a large stationery store, located almost between Insurgents and Chilpancingo Avenues, right across the street from the famous bakery called La Espiga. Soon, we found the suitable spot, right across from his business. My friend, very enthusiastically, began negotiations for rent, furniture, a computer, and all that. So, if I did the math, it turned out he had made a substantial investment amounting to about 50,000 pesos, nothing comparable to the amounts Cheo was managing, but still a lot for my new partner. When I went to visit the place, I was pleasantly surprised, although at the same time, this new enigma in my life frightened me a little. All because the place was right across the street, through the back entrance of the movie theater called Las Americas. It inevitably reminded me that America is the continent destined to flourish in the new age, as the founders of the GFU had taught, and from there, for the world. He knew about my relationship with my naturism student, and that I was breaking up with the mother of my children. This didn't matter to him. In fact, he told me about his own life, and how difficult it had been with his relationships with women, who, given his America Living Trail 148 personality, generally belonged to the celebrity world, and had betrayed him. He was a mature man, about 50 years old, but with a youthful personality. I trusted him, and told him about my situation and my strong desire to live alone, or rather, for my beloved and I to live together. He was a very strong Leo astrological sign, so he didn't beat around the bush, and, wishing me well, very soon we were at the corner of Colima and Insurgents. He said to me, "I already found the place you'll like. It's located on Victoria Street, exiting the Potrero metro station." I asked him with concern why he had found it in the industrial colony, and he replied, "The thing is, my house is very close." I stopped by and spoke to the lady, but since it's a ghost house for ladies, only it took a lot of convincing. I had to tell her that you're married, and come from the provinces, and that she'd please let you live there for a while we found a suitable place. And at the very moment my friend was giving me the good news that he'd found the place, I looked over at the corner of Insurgents, and my old friend, the manager, was walking by. She wasn't wearing any makeup, and when she saw me, she walked right past me. She wasn't the same anymore. It's as if a cycle in my love for a type of woman we might call worldly was coming to an end, and a more promising one was beginning. When I couldn't resist, that same night I called my girlfriend to tell her. She said to me, both surprised and scared, "This student lives too close to my house, just a few blocks away, since I live in this neighborhood, almost between Rio Blanco and Mysterious." I fondly remembered that I had recently turned 32 at the end of 1991, and had had a wonderful time with my new partner. All of this encouraged me to resolve the situation as soon as possible. The conditions of the new house weren't going to be easy, as it was a special ghost house, only for young ladies. I went to visit the lady, who was already over 55 years old, although well preserved. She had a very suspicious and cold nature in business matters, a typical Capricorn sign, but for some reason, she allowed herself to be persuaded. I went to see the place, and found it pleasant. I told the lady I would arrive with my things. I called my dear student again, and told her I'd soon be living near her, in the industrial colony. I noticed she became a little more frightened, which is unusual for her, but with a trembling voice, she said, "All right," as if the mother of my children sensed something. I still had a heated argument with her, and had to admit that I wasn't willing for my children to live this kind of life. So, the next day, I arrived home in Netzahualcoyotl, and spent the whole night gathering all my books and other things. Then I loaded them into the old car we had bought, and it was dawn when I, America Living Trail 149, started driving toward my new home. I was almost there when a traffic cop stopped me. He complained because the small truck was carrying a certain amount of things and junk that was obstructing the view through the rearview mirror. So we made a deal, and I gave him money, so he would then turn my vehicle over to the proper authorities. When he received the small amount of money, he was pleased, and when I asked him to protect me a little, so that another traffic cop wouldn't stop me again, he promised to go ahead, so I wouldn't be bothered. But I had barely made it 2 blocks when he fled. Anyway, I was pretty close now, and I arrived at my new place of residence without further incident. I unloaded all my things, and moved them into my room. I had begun my journey toward true freedom. About a week later, I hired the moving truck to move my grandmother's things from Netzahualcoyotl to San Juan Teotihuacan. The children were still very young. With the whole move, the hours flew by that day, so I had to stay in the new house in San Juan Teotihuacan, a block from the pyramid, with La Luna. A beautiful atmosphere, but filled with unease in my soul. I had a feeling this wasn't going to end just like that, but I wasn't willing to dwell on it. That night, the children's mother was nervous, because she thought I'd have sex with her, but I was too in love with my new partner to even think about betraying her. The next morning, I did my yoga classes, and said goodbye to the children, promising to see them as much as possible. I told their mother I would send her the rent and food money, so she wouldn't get upset. For the time being, she was satisfied, and nothing more. Because I never truly saw her happy at heart. But, in any case, the place we rented so close to the pyramid was a little paradise that, despite its rustic appearance, was filled with good energy. My new house was located just outside Victoria Street, and before reaching the Potrero metro station, I turned around, and was halfway down the block. That first morning, I woke up feeling very comfortable, and, as usual, began my psychophysical exercises, followed by a bath with natural water, for which I had to go out to the bathroom in the hallway, and finally, my yoga postures, asanas. Time marched on, and in the afternoons, I liked to walk a little further. Generally, I followed the route from Victoria Street to Mysterious Avenue, and, crossing it, reached the wide plaza of the Gustavo A. Madero district. Meanwhile, my new companion could reach this meeting point in a 10-minute walk from her mother's house, and she liked to chat with me. But generally, she would pick me up, and we would arrive together. Due to the delicate circumstances that were presenting themselves, she, more than ever, needed a lot of tenderness and trust. These were days when she began to tell me things about her life. And in less than a month, I told her she had to move in with me. Because it was the time when her husband had gone to work for 6 months. She was already considering the possibility of separating from him permanently, although she wasn't talking about divorce. In fact, I had sufficient reason to admit that our union wasn't based solely on carnal sex, but on true love. Because by then, she had already told me that the Master Lotharir spoke to her telepathically, just like the Tibetan Master and sometimes the Sublime Elder Brother. Americo Living Trail 150. All of this began one day, when we were happily lying in the hotel bed and she began to tell me that the Masters encouraged her to continue being with me. They warned her that I was not her soulmate, but that the Tibetan, Dwalkul, was. As she was anxious to know who my soulmate was, they told her that I was a woman who, like them, traveled in interstellar space, of course, in a higher dimension. But that it was not the time for us to meet, and only God knew when. It wasn't easy for my new partner to accept another relationship, knowing that her soulmate was the Tibetan himself. He himself assured her that there was no one on the planet who had a vibration similar to his except me. That she would be fine with me, because I could give her the energy to make her happy. I well remember that afternoon, when I was still the director of the Naturism School of the Naturist Center on Tabasco Street, in the Roma neighborhood. I had warned my students that to become naturopathic therapists, and receive their diploma, they would first have to complete the complete gymnastics program and yoga. To do that, I had gotten them to raise money to buy a tarp. I don't know how much they raised, or not, but they did, and we put it up in the backyard, as I said, without Dr. Shayamitchin's authorization. And it was on one of those afternoons that my new classmate received the telepathic message from the Tibetan master, telling her to stay with me, because there was no one on the planet who had the same essential vibration as me. When we finished the class, she was a little upset, struggling with her own decisions, and she told me about it. So, this was definitely not just any woman, and I could see that from what I experienced with her every day. For example, she told me that, from a young age, around 18, she no longer wanted to be in this world, and so she would go into hiding, so she wouldn't have to go to school. Without her parents' knowledge, she would meditate for long hours, day after day, whenever possible. For periods of time, instead of going to school, she would sit on a special meditation bench, and spend the entire afternoon there. And when it was time for her to return from school, she would appear before her parents and family. Her desire to find her soulmate was so great, that one day she found herself consciously transported to a large ship with many computers inside. There was the Tibetan master who began to show her many things about that great ship, explaining that they had many like this one in the universe, which over the millennia have been improved. But while they were very happy, the master of the Tibetan master rushed in, whom I later called the Supreme Master. and he strongly called the Tibetans' attention, saying, "You know very well that we can't break the law and it's not your right to be with her, yet so leave her alone." They were not allowed to have a conscious relationship in her third dimension, so she understood that it was because the Tibetan master had evolved too much, and she was still a mere human. I never ever believed literally everything this special woman told me, but I didn't deny it either. My attitude was open and natural, as my training as an astropsychologist continued to grow in my capacity for impersonality when interpreting the events of people's lives and souls. It was primarily through the scientific method that I discovered my beloved Americo Living Trail. 151 Practiced channeling and clairvoyance. I didn't deny or blindly accept this, but I allowed myself the luxury of intuiting and acting accordingly. I let myself go with the flow, but also, none of these beings who claimed to belong to me ever always interfered by overriding my free will, not once. I was always the one who made the decisions regarding my own life. But returning to what she told me about her life, for reasons I was once amazed, because her birth was miraculous. She told me that when her mother was 6 months pregnant, her water broke, and the amniotic fluid was almost completely lost. So the doctors told her mother she needed to stay still, in bed, for the remaining months, in an attempt to complete the fetal maturation cycle. Her mother obeyed and remained like that for a few months, until, thank God, she was able to emerge from the womb without any major problems. This has made me think that there are nefarious forces trying to prevent the birth of souls more advanced than ordinary people. And that, fortunately, all these adversities often lead those souls to develop superior abilities. Sometimes more than a month would pass without the Master speaking to us. Before I moved to the ghost house on Victoria Street, there was a time when she seemed to be weakening, and the relationship was in danger. We stopped having sex for more than a month. But when I was already on Victoria Street, she agreed to enter my room, posing as my wife to the owner. We had intimate relations, and were resting in bed, when she told me that at one end of the room was Master de la Ferrier dressed in white clothing in the style of the Templars, and at the other end was Master Estrada. She had no details about how they dressed, or what teachings they had written in their books, since she had never studied them, nor did she belong to the GFU. That's why when she spoke about them, I was surprised by how accurate her descriptions were of living teachings, and not just dead letters. That day I realized that Masters Estrada and de la Ferrier had approached us again because, of our own free will, we had decided to continue our relationship. They never forced us to do things their way, not even in the name of a cosmic plan. They always asked for our opinions, and, in any case, let us think about them. Later, Maestro Estrada would tell me that we were a team, because that was how the circumstances had turned out. My mind didn't easily accept all this information, even though I never denied anything a priori. What I struggled with was that Master de la Ferrier had written in his great messages that we should only follow a master of flesh and blood, and not little voices or entities from beyond. But apparently this was a special case, and I remained alert. Another thing that puzzled me was the fact that, according to the teachings of Law GFU, a celestial and terrestrial avatar only appears every 2,000 years, but at the same time, these masters of light made me feel that they were preparing me for a special mission of apostolic succession or something like that. Americo Living Trail. 152. For her part, it was also understandable that my new partner was a little afraid to just like that leave everything for me. One afternoon, we were walking along the median strip near the Potrero metro station, and at the corner of Victoria Street, I told her to go right away, and tell her parents that she was going to live with me. She agreed. Rather than walk a few blocks, she boarded a bus headed home. I waited for her right there, and 15 minutes later she was back. She got off another bus, and came over to where I was standing, anxiously waiting for her. "What happened?" I asked. "Nothing, I just don't know how to tell them." She told me that her parents were at home, but that she didn't dare talk to them about her eccentric affair with her astrology teacher. I got very serious and spoke strongly to him, telling him he had to do it. He came again, and didn't do it, and then again and again. Finally it was me who made a decision. "You want to do it later, and that's not possible. If you're not here before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'll assume you've decided to stay with your parents, and you won't find me again. You understand?" I won't be here anymore. When I was telling him this, I realized I was being very serious. So strong was my passion and conviction of my being that sometimes I couldn't define which was which. Perhaps in the midst of the sexual madness,